I'm Simon Monk. I'm the infrastructure campaigner, as was just introduced for London Cycling Campaign. I'm actually now one of two Simons who are infrastructure campaigners in London Cycling Campaign. So I have a colleague, Simon Still, as well. So it gets very confusing. London Cycling Campaign, I guess, is the kind of London quite large equivalent of Cyclox. And I was going to say, before I forget, I'm aiming to talk for hopefully less than half an hour, and then we'll have questions and answers and things like that. So I'm just going to talk very fast and gibber a lot, and then we'll get as quickly as we can to the questions. And this is a kind of a bit of a grab bag of thoughts and topics this time around, because of discussions with Cyclox folks about what would be most interesting to Oxford and Oxfordshire active travel campaigners. But if I miss anything or you want more detail, then I guess that's what the Q&A is there for at the end. So a little bit about myself and a bit about LCC. I'm a resident in Walthamstow, Waltham Forest. I've been here for decades. And around about 2005, I started volunteering for Waltham Forest Cycling Campaign. My work with Waltham Forest Cycling Campaign as a volunteer led to the Mini Holland, along with many, many other people and lots of other things that happened. So I'm not claiming sole credit for it. Clyde, I think, who's presented before, has an awful lot of the credit, but there were a whole bunch of us. In 2015, 5 years ago, I joined LCC as infrastructure campaigner, having ridden on the back of the Mini Holland experience in Waltham Forest, of which more later, and started trying to do some of the stuff that we had done in Waltham Forest and some of the stuff that was happening in some boroughs in London. Elsewhere. Now, there are 33 London boroughs, and each of them has their own take on cycling and walking and infrastructure and all sorts of stuff. And so my job is really to try and persuade more boroughs to do more cycling better, and increasingly to do more walking better and more e-scootering better and more car reduction better as well. So London Cycling Campaign, we are 11,500 member, I think, strong cycling campaign, membership body, charity. I work on infrastructure, and a huge amount of stuff we do is about infrastructure. We believe very strongly that essentially safe, comfortable, direct cycle routes are pretty key to getting lots more people cycling, and cycling is pretty key to making a greener, healthier, better city. But we also work, as well as on infrastructure, we work on road danger, police enforcement, lorries, promoting cycling. During lockdown, or during this crisis, we've launched for I think over half of our boroughs now, they have what's called a cycle buddy scheme. So you can be matched up with someone to ride into work or to your shops or whatever, and they'll show you their route, and ride with you the first couple of times you ride out. But yeah, so, and we're great believers that cycling is key, not just because it's a great thing to do, but also because we have an inactivity crisis, we have climate change, we have pollution, road danger, etc. So one of the things I've started saying of late, and I think this is really true, is my job title is infrastructure campaigner, and I will talk about infrastructure now, but really the big key to everything that we now do is actually political will. So I'm not an infrastructure campaigner, I'm a political will campaigner. That did. Okay, so what has LCC done? There's going to be a lot of photos of Mini Holland. This is at the famous Orford Road in the middle of Waltham Forest. Again, more on which later. So the last year, and one of the ironies of this crisis is, while everyone else has been out cycling and getting around, what we've in London, and I suspect in Oxford, we've seen a huge boom in cycling, in part because there haven't been any cars about, people haven't been driving anywhere, loads of people out cycling. I've put on masses of weight and I'm not cycling much at all, and my health has really, really suffered last year, because I've been chained to my desk, because in March, when the first lockdown happened, we were fully expecting to not have any schemes, nothing was going to happen, and we were busily making a case to City Hall that if they didn't do anything, then when we started coming out of lockdown, we would have cars over public transport. And so we needed to do cycling, but we didn't really think the mayor would necessarily do it. But lo and behold, in about March, he came out with his street space plan and said, last year we've been doing an awful lot of work on that, and we've probably seen, I think, decades worth of progress in a year on cycle infrastructure. So it's been a very busy time, and I've been working kind of 18-hour days pretty much for a year. One of the other unexpected things that happened was the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is the ex-mayor of London, and his key transport advisor, Andrew Gilligan, who was the ex-cycling commissioner for London, they essentially took a whole load of stuff that we did and a whole load of stuff that we were saying and just ran with it across the national stage. So the Emergency Active Travel Fund, all of the stuff around, and I'll talk about LTN 120 and gear change documents later on, a lot of the words that come out of that, and some of the words very specifically, are straight out of LCC's campaigning kind of documents, things like that. So it's been a very weird and interesting time to see the most gung-ho on walking and cycling government we've ever had, and for it to be this government was quite a surprise. So we have a kind of a reach to national stage. We are also responsible for massive expansion of cycleways and the Mini Holland schemes, which I'll talk about. Direct vision lorries coming across European legislation, that was kind of us. And we've been pushing for 20 miles an hour across London as well, and things like that. But again, all of this comes back to the central theme of my every talk I do pretty much these days, which is political will. So what we mostly do and what we concentrate on is just ensuring that there is the political will to deliver, because without it, none of this stuff happens. So here we go, Waltham Forest, Mini Holland. As the slide says, I may cry. This is my area. I've lived in it for 25 years, I think. And in 2012, in the run up to the Olympic Games, our kind of relationship with the council was, well, we gave you an ASL box at the front of the lights. What more could you possibly want? Actually, that's very unfair. That was about 2008, 2009 that was. And we did a thing called Movers and Shakers, where we went on one-on-one rides with councillors and officers. And that suddenly shifted things. It went dramatically from, we've been on a ride, we've given you a box at the front of the lights. What more could you possibly want to? Yeah, we realised that box at the front of the lights isn't actually very good, but we haven't got any money. And then in the run up to the Olympic Games in 2012, we had a meeting with Clyde Lokes, who essentially threw his hands up in the air to myself and a guy called Paul Gasson, who's quite famous from Waltham Forest, and said, well, what do you want? If you don't want ASL boxes at the front of the lights, what is it you could possibly want? And we gave him like a 10-point shopping list off the top of our heads that had things like the 10 worst junctions in the borough fixed, Lea Bridge Road, which is the worst road in the borough, to get better scheme on, 20 miles an hour everywhere, Falls lorry training for all contractors, all sorts of stuff like that. And to his huge credit, he kind of went, yeah, all right, we'll do that. So that 2012 action plan kind of was the start of the point at which the borough started taking cycling seriously and doing stuff. That led to the 2013 bid for the Mini Holland. And the Mini Holland, for those who don't know it, there are 3 London boroughs who received 30 million apiece roughly for Mini Holland money. And Waltham Forest was the one that kind of took it and went crazy with it, and did loads of stuff. So Enfield has done really good stuff as well worth having a look at what they've done. Kingston has done pretty good stuff, but Waltham Forest is the kind of the jewel in London crown, and was particularly surprising because it is a very scrappy outer London suburb. This isn't central London, this isn't the bright lights of the big city. This is a suburban bit of outer London that's quite poor, that's quite ethnically diverse, that isn't particularly a cycling hotbed, and wasn't prior to the schemes going in. What we've done is, as you can see looking around the pictures, is a massive amount of low traffic neighbourhoods, huge numbers of them. We've done major cycle routes, and that this is carried on. But the bottom right hand corner is Lea Bridge Road, was the most dangerous road in the entire borough, one of the most well used for cycling, and is now 4 kilometre long, end to end with flow cycle tracks that are just, you know, international standard. As a result of all this, we also did loads of promotion. There's bike hangers everywhere. There's cycle parking hubs at stations. As a result of all this, what we saw was we've since had, and Paul, I then joined LCC. Paul stayed on in Waltham Forest doing stuff locally as a volunteer. And he and another guy called Dan Kelly, who's now at Sustrans, they've done, I think, over 200 tours. It all started getting a bit weird when we toured the Dutch round, the Mini Holland. That felt very weird because really that felt a bit like selling coals to Newcastle. But I've toured around with Japanese folks. I toured a group of 30 Bogota engineers, and we've had loads of people from all over the UK. So you know, sadly, that hasn't obviously happened much in the last year. There was, I think, Scott, if he's on this call, there was a plan to do a kind of virtual video tour with talking heads. That hasn't quite come off yet. But have a look on Street View, have a look at some of the documents around the Waltham Forest Mini Holland. It really is an exemplary scheme for what you can do, and particularly what you can do if there is political will to do stuff. That I think that's me plugging me and all the amazing things that I've had a part in. So now let's move swiftly on to Oxford. Now, I don't know how many of you know what on earth it is you're looking at on screen, but that is the CYIPT tool, which is Cycling Infrastructure Potential tool, I think, or potentialization tool, something like that. There are several other tools. There's a tool called Propensity to Cycle tool, but one of the great things is there is now a bunch of tools from the DFT and from other places that show you where your future of cycling is, as it were. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can probably see the whole of Oxfordshire. You can see Oxford in the middle, obviously, and sundry other bits of Banbury and the edge of Reading and Abington and Didcot, all getting a little bit of a look in. And on the right of the screen, you can see kind of a closer in zoom of Oxford. Now, what's amazing about these tools is they show you very, very quickly where your highest potential corridors are. So these are corridors where there's lots of people driving short distances that could theoretically cycle. But also what's amazing about the CYIPT tool is it also adds in things like where there's width to put stuff. And I wanted to put this picture up in a way because I wanted to make the point that you know, I think a lot of people think of Oxford and there's other cities in the UK as a very medieval city, very narrow streets, you know, and actually, firstly, there are some roads in Oxford that are wide and capable of taking cycling. We're going to talk more about what you can do where there aren't wide roads, where there is a very narrow road. But I wanted to kind of put this up now, and I've ripped off a friend of mine, Ranty Highwayman, on Twitter, who is an ace person to follow on Twitter, absolutely well worth doing. If you're interested in this area, he's a highways engineer, used to work out of East London, but he's now a consultant. He had a list of these are the things, these are your priorities that every city should do, every town, every time you think about a scheme. 20 miles an hour, reduce motor traffic, so put in control parking zones, reduce parking, put in a workplace parking levy. Don't build any new roads, and I know that's going to be a huge issue in Oxfordshire. You know, smart road user charging, tolls. There are ways to restrict and reduce motor traffic, and we have to do that. We have to grasp that nettle if we're going to really deliver. And then build a network, build a cycle network. And that's not just cycle tracks, that's also things like pedestrian crossings on main roads to reduce severance, and it's low traffic neighbourhoods that enable other connections. And so that bumps onto filter through traffic from residential streets. So, you know, and that's, I think most of you heard me talking about low traffic neighbourhoods and other people talking about low traffic neighbourhoods. We were just on the Brian Deegan Ideas with Beers call before this, and there was a fascinating history, you know, and it's one of the things I've realised looking at a lot of what are called low traffic neighbourhoods in London, and for just for anyone who isn't up to speed on all this, the jargon. So low traffic neighbourhood is a primarily residential area, normally about 1 kilometre across. That is that there has no rut runs. So through motor traffic is either entirely removed or discouraged by using bollards, planters, bus gates, all sorts of different tools, one ways, etc., so that you can't drive from one main road straight through the area across the other main road. These things have been around for donkey's years, decades. And, you know, when Waltham Forest did the Mini Holland, we did, I think, 4 low traffic neighbourhoods in a big go. And that was the first time in ages that anyone had done a big chunk of these things in a row. And in fact, we called them filtered permeability cells, I think. And we had to come up with the term that other people, no doubt, came up with many times before, which was low traffic neighbourhoods. So we came up with that idea, you know, a way of explaining it simply to people, because it kind of does what it says on the tin. But we did 4 in a row, and they were hugely, really quick succession. They were hugely controversial. But one of the reasons why I think they were controversial is because it was a real shock to the system. Because in the 70s and even into the mid 80s, huge swathes of towns and cities across England were doing these things, and then we stopped. And what the ideas would be is talk today. There was a woman from Bolton, I think, talking about why it stopped, and it was changes in government funding. But you know, we used to do these things, and so if you look on a map anywhere, Oxford being no exception, I'm sure, you will find these low traffic pockets and areas that have been done either piecemeal over the years, or they've been done as a housing estate or a kind of area. But we've started doing them again. So I guess jumping on, hopefully very neatly segueing on, what can be done where there's no width for tracks? And the first and most obvious one is filtering. So low traffic neighbourhoods, if you put some bollards in the road, you can take a very narrow residential street with parking on, whatever, and turn it into a massively viable walking and cycling route that actually quite often is incredibly, you know, positive and useful for people with disabilities, you know, people in mobility scooters and wheelchairs and things like that, as well as people walking, and has massive community benefits and all sorts of things like that. So simply by removing the through traffic, you get the traffic levels down low enough that you can see kids cycling. Now, this road, this is Francis Road in Leighton in the Waltham Forest Mini Holland. This is the second scheme after Orford Road, which I showed you earlier, where this is actually a bus route. So this is and I know it's not incredibly narrow in the sense that the pavements are massively wide, but this was a big B road that I think was 2-way in this section. So 2 lanes of traffic, and they basically got rid of the 2 lanes of traffic, made it 1 way. The bus still passes through here, so that you'll get a bus through here every 10 minutes or so. But other than that, you can see kids scooting about. You know, there's a kid in front on a bike on the pavement, but loads of people just ambling into the road and things like that, because there's hardly any other traffic at all. And so just by doing that for this short stretch, this road and these lovely Victorian shop fronts that you can see, this was like an accountant's firm that had its windows shut all the time, bookies, a kebab shop, and a load of shut businesses. And since this has gone in, most of these shop fronts have reopened. In Orford Road, the equivalent other scheme in Walthamstow, for the first time in over 20 years when the scheme opened, since the scheme has opened, there's not a single unit that hasn't been let. So you've got businesses thriving. And in fact, you know, there's constant complaints on social media about how Orford Road in Walthamstow is too busy during this crisis. There's too many people going out for their shopping in Orford Road and going and having a little coffee or whatever and standing outside. So there's lots of complaints about social distancing and kind of it's too much a success, you know, suddenly. But both roads were fundamentally very, very run-down retail parades. So you know, bus gates are a massively powerful thing. Now, obviously, you don't want your child, you know, to be mixing in on a road where there's like 3,000 buses a day. It doesn't work for every road, but if there's only a bus every 10 minutes or 5 minutes, actually this just works really well for an environment that's good for cycling too. What else you can do is car parking removal. It's incredible the amount of space that we see even in city centres for car parking on street, that if that was gone, you've instantly got enough room for a cycle track. You've got kind of room for other things. One way, as I mentioned, this was a two-way, there's now a one-way road. And simply removing the lane, making something one way, while it has some severance issues in other ways, and it can increase speed of cars, you know, he'll hair down a one way that they won't at a two-way road. It can also free up enough space for cycling. But there are all sorts of other things that you see all over Holland, all over Europe. One of these, you know, one of these Waltham Forest did, which was amazing, was we had a very narrow section of road and they just rolled the curbs. So they rolled the curbs by 90 degrees and that saved about, I don't know, even 6 inches. And it was just enough to make a viable cycle track, just that extra bit of space. But again, looking at all of this, it comes down to political will. So where is the will to start saying to drivers, that was a two-way road, it's now a one-way road, or that was a cut through, but now it's a bus route and nothing else. So political will remains the single biggest determinant of whether you have council officers who come up with ideas like this, and whether you have, you know, schemes that come forward and find funding. So that jumps onto, and again, a bit of a very brief plug. On the LCC site, there is a page that's the activism page, and we've got handbooks on there. And I would urge anyone who really wants to be a campaigner in an organised way to read some of those handbooks. You know, our activist handbook is really, really worthwhile. Our infrastructure handbook, I would say this thing as I co-wrote it, is great. But you know, it's really important. I mean, I can't be an expert on Oxford. You folks are all the experts on Oxford and Oxfordshire. But to ask yourself who you're, you know, what the aim and the vision is for the city and for the county long term, and the other towns. What are the key asks that come from that? And then who are your allies and your opposition, and how to surmount those issues. One of the things, I did a workshop with a bunch of campaigners in London a while ago, and I told them, and I'm not going to do this to you, I'm not going to put you on the spot tonight, because I've got to rattle through the remainder of my slides very quickly. But one of the things I asked a bunch of campaigners in the room is to pull out a phone and research their cabinet lead for transport. Go on Twitter, go on LinkedIn, go on, you know, the council declaration of interest, do all these things, find out what they care about. And I think one of the things that another thing that I've asked, you know, I've talked about before, is we had a borough in London where the cabinet lead would talk non-stop. Their Twitter profile, everything about them was all about social justice, all about Black Lives Matter. And it was great. You know, they're really into social justice, they're really into that. That's, you know, obviously a very important thing to be into. What was fascinating was, so we as I talked to local cycle campaign, they talked to me about it, and so their whole approach became about how cycling is a social justice issue, about how poor people cycle, about how poor people are in transport poverty, about how poor people and our BAME communities are disproportionately in London impacted by pollution, inactivity, road danger, all sorts of stuff that cycling really helps with. Had no impact whatsoever, didn't land at all right. And then we realized that every time there was a photo opportunity, the cabinet member turned up. And so we had to say, okay, hang on a minute. So while they're talking this, their actions are speaking louder than words, and the actions are about press opportunities. And that council really turned out, and the local group started just hitting them constantly, saying, can you turn up at this thing? Can you turn up at that thing? And if they didn't turn up to something, then council, you know, cabinet leader doesn't, you know, snub cycle coming. So they made it all about press coverage, and that had a huge impact. So it's not just who are your allies and who is your opposition and how do you get, but how do you win them over? What do they care about? So do your research. And I think, you know, with you know, an area like Oxford and Oxfordshire, you have a really complicated system. I mean, London, we have TfL and the mayor, and they control 5% of the roads, and then we have the boroughs that control 95% of London's roads, and there's 33 of them. So it's a very complex situation, but I don't even think that is as complex, frankly, as the relationship between a city council, you know, and a county council. So you folks have to be aware of that, and I'm sure we can talk more about that in the Q&A afterwards. But I think all of this is about managing and levering political will really, really carefully, and winning it. You know, you need to make a case to these people about what they care about and why cycling and walking and, you know, motor traffic reduction and motor car usage reduction is important to them, you know, and aligns with their views. And that is one of the great things about particularly cycling, working in cycling campaigning. And I feel very lucky about this, and working in active travel is genuinely, you know, if you are a conservative councillor and you want, you know, efficient business and, you know, low taxes and all the things that conservative councillors can want, cycling and walking wins. If you are a Labour councillor that cares incredibly about social justice outcomes and poor people, cycling and walking still wins. So wherever you are on the political spectrum, cycling and walking should be really to us. They often aren't, but it's about working out how you overcome that kind of opposition, you know, because you know, I've lost count in London. We're fairly heavily Labour in London, and I've lost count of the number of councillors that I've had to have a conversation with about how cycling is just for middle class white men like me. And so for me, that's, you know, you have to be able to have that conversation and say, well, no, here's why you're wrong on that one. And I recognise in Oxfordshire that there may be other concerns, but I think ferreting them out and working out what they are is really important. And this comes to, I guess, the art of knowing when to be positive and negative. And this is one of the conversations I had with, I think, Andy at Cyclox, was about, you know, when do you support a scheme? When do you embrace a scheme and say this is positive? And when do you say, you know, it's negative? And I think, you know, we increasingly in London, we're very blessed. We have multiple organisations, you know, we have multiple approaches. So we have a Stop Killing Cyclists, you know, who do things, and XR who do things that are very scary for most politicians to deal with. And that's great, because I can then go and be the softly good cop and say, no, let's work out a way forward, etc. So when politicians don't want what you want, or they don't understand what you want, or they don't even care what you want, you know, there's always a question there. And how hard and how soft to kind of go is a question. And do you need more than one organisation in space? Do you need different approaches in different ways to kind of reach people? I think is always really good. And I've got a couple of little things that I say all the time. So I don't know whether this applies to Cyclox. I feel it doesn't, but it does apply to a lot of our London groups, which is the definition of insanity is not to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Or as I've written it down here in my notes, don't be miserable and right. Be positive and compromise. Don't make perfect the enemy of good. And so for us in London, one of the rubrics, and I'm going to come on to things like cycling level of service and the DFT's new documents, which are amazing tools. But we have a much more simple, rather than scoring out a scheme and working out exactly whether it has a critical issue and what its cycling level of service score is, we have a simpler rubric for whether we support schemes generally. And that is, will it enable a much wider range of people to cycle? Will it enable all ages of people to cycle, younger kids, people with disabilities, etc.? Will it make it much safer for the people who are already cycling there? You know, so even if a scheme doesn't enable loads more people to cycle, but the people who are cycling there are going to be alive when they get to the end of the route, that's quite a good thing. Is it good value for money? You know, so we've had some schemes where we've gone, God, this is really just a very mediocre scheme, but it's really cheap. So you know what? That's better the council does it than does nothing and spends the money on potholes or building more roads or whatever. And is this the first time a council is doing something? It's being a bit bold. It's being a bit brave. You know, do we want to just give it some support to just, yeah, well done. You did something. That's better than nothing. And then I've said, one of the things I said, and this is something really important, is, you know, these webinars, these Zooms over the last year, it's been great. Twitter is an amazing space for campaigning, but I challenge every group that I talk to, and not just every group, but everyone on this call. What will you personally do to make change? Because that's the thing that, you know, one of the things we're really lucky with London is we've just got tons of people, 8.6 million, I think, of them at the moment. So, you know, we have a large pool to draw from. But one of the things that's really important is in every borough, we've got people who actually just crack on and keep sending those emails and ringing people up and keep doing door-to-door leaflets and keep just going. So what will you do personally to make change, I think, is a really important question to ask yourself, because Twitter doesn't, you know, I'm on Twitter all the time. People who follow me on Twitter will know how grumpy I am on Twitter and how prolific I am on Twitter. But Twitter is utterly meaningless for my job. And I think people really mistake what I do on Twitter as my job, and it's not. What I do as my job is actually talking to politicians all the time and talking to officers and rounding up campaigners and helping campaigners plot their next move. And, you know, and in my years in Waltham Forest, I, you know, knocked on a lot of doors, I leafleted a lot of doors, and we did a lot of street to street, door to door activity. And actually that's really important, is just getting people out riding, being on a bike, talking to other people, talking to politicians is far more important than anything else you can do. So I think that's good cop, bad cop. Very quickly, I'm going to finish up very shortly. Sorry, I'm running over. I think it's a changing world. You know, COVID continues to be utterly horrific, but also continues to be the largest cycling boom this country has seen for decades in all sorts of weird ways. And it's shaking up our cities and our towns. How many of us will, you know, get on a train and go long distances 5 days a week in 5 years' time for their jobs? I don't know if that's going to ever come back in the way it was before. In London, Paris, other cities, we're talking increasingly about 15-minute neighbourhoods, 15-minute cities, having everything you need and want within 15 minutes walk of your home, and not needing to get in a car anymore for those kind of journeys. So there is all sorts of changes. In London, certainly we're now finally having a conversation about smart road user charging and charging by mile and charging all over London and things like that, charging by emissions, etc. Because we have to now, because TfL finances are in a pit, because no one's riding the tube, no one's riding the buses, and we're losing, you know, money very fast. So we are having to change very rapidly under our funding model, and that has some opportunities. In London, I think, as I mentioned at the top, COVID kicked off the street space funding and the street space program, which has seen decades worth of progress in 9 months. So it's been quite incredible. And a change in government attitude. And I think if you haven't read, I strongly recommend everyone reads. I hesitate to say this, actually, don't all read this document, but LTN 120 and gear change that came out from the DFT quite early on in the crisis. These two documents represent a sea change in the way the government thinks about walking and cycling. They're still set to spend 27 billion on road building, so they're not quite there yet. Their priorities, in my view, are still massively out of whack. But we have a Prime Minister and a key transport advisor and a whole bunch of people now in the DFT for the first time ever who think cycling is quite important and think walking is quite important, and even think that reducing the amount of car driving we do is quite important. So we have some very, very strange times for governmental and DFT kind of, that I think is typified by there's three different bits of stuff I've just cut out and pasted. On the left, figure 4.1, that is what the government now says is the level of motor traffic you can have and speed before you start losing people cycling. So essentially at 20 miles an hour, you're okay in a cycle lane or a mandatory kind of or advisory cycle lane up to about 5,000 vehicles a day. And after that, that orangey thing is saying that's not really suitable for a lot of people. The pink thing is that's suitable for hardly anyone whatsoever. And the green is like most people can do that and cycle there. So what they're saying essentially, you know, if you're next to a 30-mile-an-hour road, basically you need a cycle track. You know, and you can fudge it with a cycle lane, but you get it already. At 20 miles an hour, you know, above 5,000, you're talking about get a cycle track in there. So this is again a massive shift in government rhetoric. Now, it's down to us to hold individual councils and boroughs to this kind of chart. but as a sign of where the government is thinking you should go and council should go, it's a massive shift. The bottom left-hand corner of that is what's called the JAT, or Junction Assessment Treatment. And that shows you green, very simply green, orange, red, kind of arrows for how easy those turns are to make at a junction. And again, the DFT is basically saying designers of highway schemes need to start thinking about this stuff. What are the hook risks that you face? Where are the problems? How easy is it to get a kid through this junction? And which movements would someone who wasn't massively confident feel comfortable doing? And then finally, this is, I cannot stress this strongly enough, right? So this is part of what's called the Cycling Level of Service, or CLOS scheme. The DFT is basically saying for cycling schemes, they will not fund a scheme less than a score of 70 or with any what are called critical fails. And that's a massive, massive shift to hold your council to account. Because if they turn out schemes with those critical issues in, or a weak scheme, and massively high bar. It's the bar that we set in London, and we very rarely make it. When I spoke to Brian Deegan, who essentially came up with Cycling Level of Service, or helped co-write it, he was like 70 is Dutch level of quality. So for schemes to get funding now, they're meant to reach a Dutch level of provision. And I don't know if you can see it on my screen. I've got loads of talking heads in the way, but it's got, where you can see there's a black bar right on the right hand side of the screen. It has a list of the critical issues. These are all the critical issues. And again, the key one is, for instance, if you're mixing with traffic over 10,000 vehicles a day, or more than 5% of HGVs, that's a critical fail if you don't have protected space. So again, what you're saying is, you're saying main roads, because basically every main road really has over 10,000 vehicles a day. Main roads are now, you either have a cycle track or you don't get funding. So similarly, there's a really key one that we use in London all the time, is that 3.2 to 3.9 metre wide lanes. So if you are expecting cyclists to share with motor traffic in a lane that's between 3.2 and 3.9 metres wide, that's verboten from the scheme. That's forbidden. You can't do it. So there's loads of stuff like that. It's well worth knowing this. And I've written down here, and I think this is really, really vital, is this is not about being an expert engineer. Let the engineers be experts. Don't, as a group, spend decades poring over these documents. Use them as a way to help engineers and to set a bar. So stick to critical issues and stuff like that. It's very simple. It works. That's it. I didn't realize that was it, but that is it. That's my last slide. So hopefully questions and answers. And I'll stop sharing now, because in that way we can all see each other.
Thank you, Simon. Lots to think about, and I'm going to hand over to Andy, because there's many questions have been posted up in the chat. You're in mute, Andy. That's the new COVID words.
I'm very impressed. Sadiq Khan, the mayor, for the New Year's fireworks display, one of the things that popped up was a thing that said you're on mute.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's inspiring and difficult to know where to start. We've had a lot of questions come up on chat, but perhaps the issue that we'd like to start with is, how do you create the good relationship with Transport for London and the Mayor's office? Do they see you as a thorn in your side, in their side, or how does that work? Have you got an open door?
I wouldn't say tonight. I mean, at times. So I've worked very hard. I've been at LCC 5 years. I can't really speak to LCC before that, and I think it would be fair to say we've been on, as an organisation, we've been on a massive journey, very clearly in our relations. You know, in 2012, 2013, in the run up to 2012, sorry, in the run up to Boris's second election, we had protests. We were out 10,000, I think, of us. Did the biggest ever ride in London on Blackfriars Bridge, which is now the site of Cycleway 6 protected space. So there have been some very testy periods of time. We did a protest at Bank Junction following a fatality there. There have been times when we've had to be quite tough, and our relations with City Hall and TfL have been testy, to say the least. But I think we've always, long before I got there, we've always tried to have constructive relations. I think the way I would put it is critical friend. We are a genuinely critical friend. So there is a critical bit and there is a friend bit. I'm glad to say over time, we're more friend than critical, but we still, I will regularly fall out with Will Norman and he'll ring me up and be exasperated with me. Sorry, he's the Walking and Cycling Commissioner for London. And we'll have our moments, but I think now we're at a point where they recognise that we have a level of expertise. We know what we're talking about. We don't say things without a good evidence base. We say things because they matter and they count. And we will call them out where they behave badly or whatever, but we're broadly trying to do the same things there. But that's also partly a factor of the fact that they've shifted. So, I think going back 15 years in London, we'd have had a very different relations because we'd have been fighting to get them to do stuff. It's only 2012, really, after Boris's second election, where he pledged to do protected space. Until that point, he was all about blue paint, and he was quoted as saying, "Oh, it's fine to ride around the Elephant and Castle junction." That was a junction that claimed numerous lives. So it took a while to get to the point where we could sit down at the table and both be a respected partner and understood as a bunch of experts on one hand, and on the other hand, sit down opposite someone who actually was going to do something in the vague direction we were. So I think it is a journey, and there's still bumps and hiccups and whatever. But yeah, broadly, my view, and I say this over and over again, is it's far better to be constructive and helpful and friendly. And you kind of, what is that phrase? Walk quietly and carry a big stick, I think is my
right.
view on that.
Thank you, and I think that's how we aspire. One of the things when we were exchanging emails was this thorny issue of the roads that are just the wrong width, and you touched upon it briefly, and I think said you can't have a cycle lane, and I'm not quite sure. I don't know whether you've got any more information, but the ones we struggle with are between 3.2 and 3.9 meters wide, and there seems no satisfactory solution because they're very busy roads and nobody knows how to make the cars disappear.
Yeah, well, so there's a great, I was just reading today, there's a great Wired article about induced demand. I've tweeted it today. You can pick it up quite easily. But essentially, a long study in America of the growth of road capacity in America, in American cities over, I think, 20 years, matches identically to the growth in traffic. So Los Angeles went up 10% in road capacity over 20 years and went up 10% in traffic, and so, and the reverse of induced demand, which is traffic evaporation. So the simple answer here is all that traffic, it has to go, and the first step to it going is to start to remove capacity from the network, or charge it off the network, is another option. I can see Graham's waving his hand on that one and urging what's coming, but just to finish on that, so in terms of width and stuff like that, please never allow boroughs to make normal councils to make normal road lanes that you expect people to cycle on that are between 3.2 and 3.9 meters wide. That width, the reason why it's a critical issue, critical fail in DFT guidance even now, is because that's the point at which you get overtaken very close, basically. So below 3.2, drivers realise they have to drive into the oncoming lane. They have to go round you, and then they tend to give you a bit of space. Above that width, they can pass inside the lane, and they can do so fairly safe. It might feel quite hostile, but it's not very dangerous. But 3.2 to 3.9, we really learned to avoid that in London. So if you've got narrow roads in that area, just cut it down to 3.2 and use the other width, the remaining width, for something else, whether that's extra pavement if you can't fit cycle tracks, or whether that's just be able to squeeze in a cycle track just on the width, you know, or whatever, you know. But yeah, when avoid those widths and either go big or generally speaking, just stick to 3.2. The other thing with that is, yeah, you know, again, it is all down to political will. So if you have narrow streets, can you make them bus only? Can you make them one way? Can you close them off to traffic completely? You know, the more you do that, the more you reduce the capacity for people to drive, the fewer people will drive and the less traffic you will have. So it's an iterative, painful process, but it does appear to be the only game in town, unless Oxfordshire is about to wholesale embrace road user charging and tolls and things like that. Then the other alternative is just start cutting bits of the road network out, you know, bit by bit.
Thank you. Catherine, do you have?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. One is, in spite of all the evidence, a lot of businesses seem to think they'll lose out. And how to convince them?
Please let me know on answer the postcard. TfL have done a really creditable job actually on producing. There is a business economic impacts of cycling and walking briefing pack for businesses or something. It's called something like that. And they've rounded up a load of evidence in there. Businesses still do not believe it, you know, and that's, again, this is about political will. So if your councillor, you know, if your lead cabinet councillor says, well, we'll put the scheme out and we'll do a consultation and we'll see how it goes, you're doomed. If your cabinet lead is going into businesses and saying to officers, you need to go into the businesses, you need to explain to them what the scheme is, you need to hear their views, but you also need to tell them to grasp the opportunity because it's kind of coming and they can impact and change the way the scheme might be designed or whatever. But the one thing we're not going to do is just cancel it because a couple of businesses say they must have that parking out front. You know, the other thing, one of the things that Waltham Forest did, you know, and you know, clearly I'm very proud of Waltham Forest, but we actually have done quite a lot of good stuff here. One of the things that was brilliant was in the Leabridge Road scheme. So the Leabridge Road is pretty much of the 4 kilometres of this amazing end-to-end redesign of an entire road, you know, building line to building line. What most of Leabridge Road is small shops. So there is a chunky bit down near the Lee Valley that's quite green and nice. There's a bit of a rail line, there's a bit of industrial estate, but nearly all of it is just end to end, a massive long high street of shops. And those folks, they were terrified of that scheme. They thought that was going to be the end of their world. And a lot of these businesses, they're you know, again, they're quite small independent businesses. These are not big chains, nor are they posh shops. That was a scrappy road at the time, and so these shops were a lot of BAME, small business owners. And so the last thing we wanted to do was put them out of business. So the council very rightly did an awful lot of work on loading and delivery and parking. But one of the strokes of genius they did was they did 2 things, and one is quite widely talked about, and the other one isn't. The first thing they did was they went and talked to businesses and said, what percentage do you think, what proportion of customers do you think arrive by car, foot, bus, etc.? They then went and asked the visitors, so all the customers that were in the shop, and for several hours, you know, coming back and forwards, they kept asking customers. They said, well, how did you arrive today? Businesses thought 60% of the customer arrived by car, 20% of the customer arrived by car. So re-pointing that back to the business and saying you're wrong, and here's the evidence to show you're wrong. But they did one further thing, which is they actually did a parking survey, which was a stroke of genius. So they then asked the very same business owners and the customers, and they said, we've been walking up and down this road for hours now. That car there that's in the bay, that's been there for 4 hours. Whose is it? And the vast majority of customer and visitor parking that was supposedly utterly vital for these businesses to survive was the business owners who arrived in the morning, unloaded from their boot or from their van or whatever, and then left their car, despite the fact there is a car park just off Leabridge Road, left their car sitting there for the whole day and then claimed that it was vital for their business. It was like, actually, what's vital for your business is you can load first thing in the morning. That's the only bit of this is vital. And we went from businesses threatening, you know, protests, businesses having posters, hundreds of posters the whole length of Leabridge Road. About a week later after they did this, like 3 posters and a bunch of grumbly businesses who were like, and since then, you know, the businesses seem to be doing well. And, you know, that's the other thing is what's amazing is Waltham Forest, again, anecdotally, the LTNs, the businesses inside the LTNs are doing amazingly and bucking the national trend on retail incredibly. But the businesses on the outside of the LTN on the main roads, they're doing really well as well. And you know, but businesses don't feel this stuff. I mean, you know, in fact, to be honest, one of the businesses right in the heart of Walthamstow Village, in the middle of the LTN. I had a conversation as a pub, and I had a conversation with the pub where they had a massive moan at me about deliveries and the beer lorry coming round, and they couldn't work out how to do it and stuff like that. And then they had the gall to say, well, it's a disaster for business. And I was like, it's Tuesday afternoon and your pub is full. It's full of people. I've never seen your pub full of people on a Tuesday afternoon. And he then said, but they're not buying beer, they're buying coffee. And that's, we've got no margin on coffee. And I was like, okay, so you admit that the footfall on Alford Road is up like 500%, 1,000%. It's insane. And you admit that your pub is full. You haven't managed to convert your customers to drink beer. That's not the scheme's fault. That's your business failing to do the right thing there, you know. And it's just like, so you can't win with businesses. I think it's the honest answer, but you can try and remove as much of the panic and the worry as you can, but you're also going to have to face at some point a conversation with the cabinet lead that just says, you know what, you're going to have to kind of help them on this one a bit, you know.
Yeah. And another question we had was about diversity. How can we improve the diversity of our cyclists, basically, certainly in Oxford?
Well, I would say this, firstly, build routes, build infrastructure. You know, one of my great joys in Waltham Forest is I'm quite often am riding, you know, before all this crisis happened, I would use Lea Bridge Road as a commuting route. And at 8 in the morning, I'd be riding, you know, westward on Lea Bridge Road, and there would be 30 women in hijabs riding eastward, all grinning their faces off, because we have not one but 2 Muslim women cycling groups in the borough now. You know, and both those groups very clearly and evidently say openly that they would not exist, and the vast majority of their user base would not be cycling were it not for the infrastructure. So I'm 50. I'm not fit anymore, but I used to be quite fit. I'm white and I'm male. I will cycle with insane conditions in traffic, and a lot of people who look like me will. There's something about being a middle-aged man, middle-aged white middle-class man, that enables us to not particularly experience terrifying road conditions as terrifying road conditions. Most other people, most of the population of the planet, are far saner than I am. And they refuse, quite rightly, to cycle in stupid conditions. So you have to make the conditions work for them. And when you do make the conditions work for them, all of the evidence shows that suddenly the diversity of cycling goes completely, you know, much wider. There are all sorts of other issues. And, you know, and what's been fascinating is from those 2 Muslim women riders groups, there's a whole bunch of issues and other barriers that I don't experience and I'm not aware of beyond infrastructure. But the single biggest thing you can do, the single most easy, obvious thing to do is just build really good cycling infrastructure and routes, because that's what delivers removes 90% of the barriers. And then you only have to think about the 10%. You know, we had another thing that in Waltham Forest was we had the rise of the cargo bikes. And, you know, I can remember a time when I would know most cyclists in the ASL next to me on Lea Bridge Road. And then I can remember the time where suddenly there were a load of people I didn't know. And then I can remember the time when there were just hundreds of cargo bikes in the, you know, on the track next to me. And I was like, where did all these bloody cargo bikes come from? They're taking up all the space. Brilliantly, the cargo bike riders in Waltham Forest, mums, delivery drive riders, all these people, they had to mount a campaign to tell the local council to stop putting in those 2-tier racks everywhere, because they can't lock their bikes to anything. So then we had a big campaign from those folks saying, we can't lock our bikes up because you've built these really narrow racks all together at all the stations and everything like that. So they've then had to fight, you know, for that. And that's you know, I don't ride a cargo bike, I ride a bike. And so I didn't think about that, and the council office didn't think about that. But that as an issue is a second level issue after the infrastructure. None of those cargo bikes were anywhere to be found before the infrastructure went in. Once it was in, they started complaining about other issues. And thankfully, the council then said, oh, yeah, right, fair point, we'll do that. But the infrastructure comes first.
Thank you. And one of our listeners is a teacher and wonders, where does school streets fit in, and how did you incorporate those in Waltham Forest?
So school streets. So we've had, I think we have 300 school streets in London at the moment, something like that. In the last 8 months, it's been incredible. School streets are great, but they are a gateway drug to LTNs, in my view. And in fact, actually, we're starting to go back the other way. We're not. So school streets, it's very rare. We've had a couple of school streets in London of the hundreds where we've started to see the kind of level of opposition and pushback and attacks on them that we've seen on LTNs and cycle tracks. And that was quite a surprise, because I'm like, kids being able to get to school nicely and safely without, that's surely just a flat out winner. And broadly it has been. So they're great. They are brilliant because they enable you to reduce motor traffic in some areas really without a lot of opposition. So they're a really good stepping stone from that point of view. And they start to build the will to say, you know what, it's lovely that my kids, they can get outside the school and they can play in the street, and that's lovely, but why is the rest of their journey to school still rubbish? So you start to have that conversation, just as play streets, I think, do that as well, that they're a stepping stone in a direction towards saying we don't need a car as a family, we don't need to drive everywhere, and actually the more our kids are out and about on foot, on scooters, on bikes, the better it is for them and all of us. So I think they're a really great starting point. And for some of the boroughs in London who have not managed to do LTNs, who've not managed to do cycle tracks, who've not managed to do the bigger, bolder schemes, again, they're a really valuable way of saying we're going to try and do something. And look, the world didn't, we did 10 of these and the world didn't end, and that was a good thing, I think more than that, if you can do them in a way that then enables them to be part of a bigger scheme, that's even better. So Hackney did this first in London. They put a school street next to a bus gate, and suddenly you had essentially a part-time low traffic neighbourhood, and that area is totally changed. It's at the bottom end of London Fields for anyone who knows London, but it's brilliant. And now we're seeing actually Waltham Forest, we're seeing school streets go into LTNs. So what we're seeing is where you've already got a low traffic neighbourhood, you've got no through traffic, but at 8:30 there's loads of parents driving into the LTN to go to 50 metres from the school gate, park up, then come back out the LTN, and invariably at high speed. Those folks are being gently nudged out of that kind of behaviour by a school street inside an LTN. So that I think they're great is the short answer, but they are not. They're not the end. They're the start.
And changing sort of a bit further upstream, as it were, one of the frustrations is how to influence planning proposals that aren't dependent on Emergency Active Travel Fund or other external funding. How do you manage to get engaged at an earlier stage with sort of initiatives that are coming through internally, as it were?
I think this still, to me, comes back to political will. If your transport lead cabinet member is like, I want to do more for cycling, I want to do more in terms of reducing car use, then once you've got them on board, it becomes a relatively simple thing to turn around to them and say, there's this massive mega development that's coming on over there, and it's locking in car dependency for thousands of households. Shouldn't we do something about that? Is that okay? And then they can talk to their colleague and start bringing them on board. I think that's the ideal, but there is, again, it is all about political will. It's about talking to officers, it's about talking to councillors, who's the planning lead on, who's the lead of the planning committee or whatever, and starting to say, and one of the weird and great things is almost everywhere I go, the policies are in place, the national level and at regional level and at local level. You will have some massive document, thick as a phone book, that covers the planning policies, and there will be stuff in there about car dependency and car use and planning for all these things. And it's just a matter of saying to kind of often, once that political will is there, it's a matter of saying, look, your policies are saying to encourage walking and cycling and discourage car ownership and car use. How do we enable that in a development that is 2 miles from the city centre and utterly cut off, you know, walking and cycling wise, and locks in 3 cars a household and whatever, you know. So I think it's about starting to have that conversation, but the political will remains the drive on this, you know, because the political will is the difference between, you know, your council going, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that, let's have a talk about that, let's try and work out a way forward, and your council going, well, why would I care, why would I want to do that, you know? And that's the difference. Is the moment you've got a council who starts saying, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, we'll look into that, you're kind of on the right road. The moment you've got a council that says, I'll look into that, and then comes back and says, we looked into it, here's the answer, we're going to do this, we've changed this, then you know you're really flying. Yeah. But when you've got a council that says, who cares, then you're nowhere. And you know, that's your barrier there.
One question that I don't think she's actually in the audience, but when we were publicising it, she was concerned that cyclists need encouragement to behave well on cycle paths, and she wondered whether good design should include some signs that codify rules, in a way, simple rules for safe and considerate cycling. And I wonder if, when you're suggesting improvements, whether you ever think this is necessary, or how you've approached, if you like, good cycle behaviour.
So we at LCC, we're constantly trying to encourage good cycling behaviour, and we're broadly very in favour of good cycling behaviour and against bad cycling behaviour. But the simple answer again is actually well-designed infrastructure. So the classic example of this is the cycle superhighways, the first two, the north, south, and the east, west in London. They have well over 95%, I think, what's called compliance. So you're riding on the cycle superhighway, all the very same people who are running through red lights and riding across zebras and on the pavement, whatever, elsewhere in London, they all suddenly become relatively calm, sensible cyclists. And they do it because they're in an environment where that's what's designed to be encouraged, and that's what feels right. So, you know, that's the simple answer is good design is self-reinforcing. You don't need, and actually lots of signage and lots of all this other stuff doesn't tend to help much in that sense at all. So I think the more that you design, and you know, the classic example of the City of London Bank Junction, horrific 7-arm junction that had several fatalities at, we protested at, Stop Killing Cyclists protested at. City of London closed it to all but buses and cyclists 7 till 7. And before they did it, they were really worried because the city is quite conservative with a small c, august body of, you know, aldermen and kind of, you know, strange semi-Masonic kind of feudal structure that it has politically. Those folks were like, we're really worried about because there's loads of cyclists cutting through all the red lights, and at Bank Junction they speed like crazy. It's really, really hostile environment. Cyclists are really aggressive. We're really worried that we're going to make this loads better and we're just going to have loads of cyclists ploughing into pedestrians. What can we do? So we did a week with them of handing out leaflets and saying, please behave, please behave. Now we knew that the people who ride through the red lights are not the people who stop and take a leaflet and be nice about it. So we weren't reaching them. But what we also took a big gamble on and guessed was that actually those folks would just disappear. And lo and behold, the very same people were then, when the junction cleared out, they were like, oh yeah, I'll just amble through. So reducing the hostility of the road conditions reduced the aggressiveness of the response. And I know this, you know, myself, when I used to ride to work through Tower Hamlets, horrible area where they've not done anything for ages. They're now doing stuff finally, which is brilliant, but I'm not riding to the office, which is slightly annoying. But Tower Hamlets hadn't done anything for ages. Their roads were some of the most hostile in London. And I'd be like, you know, really aggressively, elbows out, ride fast or whatever. And so my riding certainly changes to the conditions of the road. And when you remove the hostility and aggression that you face on a moment by moment basis in some bits of London, suddenly you find people ride quite differently, even the very same people, the people who are most aggressive. So I think the simple answer is yes, we should all behave. And we are trying to ensure that as many people as possible understand that behaving courteously, particularly around pedestrians, is a really good thing to do. But at the end of the day, again, infrastructure wins.
Yeah. Catherine.
I have a question on air pollution. will the issue of air pollution now become a galvanizing issue? And also, is there a way of getting people to realize that just electric vehicles is not the answer?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we have to hammer, so jumping to the second bit first, we have to hammer electric vehicles as hard as we can, because there are billions of pounds behind electric vehicles, probably trillions, you know, and they don't solve congestion, they don't solve pollution because of particulates, they don't solve climate change, they don't solve inactivity, they don't solve road danger. So they are not, they are part of the solution. And I was going to say, I would really recommend our Climate Safe Streets report. I didn't write it, I can't claim any credit for it, but I'm actually really proud of it. I think it's a great document, all about what the next 10 years of cities should and has to be if we're to tackle climate change. And we talk very explicitly, you know, and for a cycling campaign, it's a slightly uncomfortable thing to start talking about how great electric cars are and things like that. So we're very pro electric vehicles, but they are not the big solution, and they are being touted as the big solution because there's a whole bunch of people who have vested financial interest in that, but there's also a whole bunch of people who want the future to look as much and as close to the current as possible. So it's very easy to say we'll all be driving electric cars in the future, because that means that we'll still all be driving cars, but we can't all keep driving cars. So a whole bunch of us have to get out of cars. You know, 20 to 60% of car journeys have to disappear, basically, according to various experts. So for climate and various other things. So electric cars are not the answer, or they're part of the answer, but they're a small part of the answer. That's the first thing. On pollution, and you know, we are busily promoting alternatives, and we're busy pointing out why electric cars can't be the answer, but how they fit into the future, how we need to control them and reduce overall car use and things like that, and enable alternatives, and what the alternatives are, you know. So we're very lucky in London. We have Pedal Me, for instance, and you know, that's, if you've not seen them, they're amazing cargo bikes that can carry hundreds of kilos, and you know, have done entire house moves and office moves and things like that. So there's all this stuff going on that you're like, wow, this enables us to do things without a van, without a car, without stuff like that. And the evidence based on that is really key. There's a great, they did some work with Crossrail, and they were clearing higher loads quicker through the city than vans, because they could use the cycle tracks. So they were getting onto cycle tracks and speeding past all the vans stuck in traffic. So there's some amazing stuff, and we'll keep pumping that. In terms of pollution is a slightly double-edged sword in London at the moment, because we have a whole bunch of folks who are campaigning against low traffic neighbourhoods, particularly, but also against cycle tracks, because these things supposedly slow down traffic, and that creates more pollution, and it creates more pollution supposedly on the main roads. Now, the evidence isn't with these folks, but it doesn't stop them from making a whole load of claims. So pollution is one of the areas where we've seen a lot of campaigners that you would hope would be pro these schemes, proactive travel, you know, green campaigners even, who come out and gone, nope, don't like it, don't want it, it's terrible because it's made pollution 3% worse on this main road for the next 2 months, you know. And you're like, yeah, it's a temporary hit, but overall pollution on that main road will go down in a year, you know, it'll be lower than it was before. And they're like, no, if it goes 3% up, I'm not having it all done. So we're struggling with that one at the moment with pollution. But yeah, pollution is a massive issue. What I don't understand is inactivity is, I mean, inactivity in the UK is at an insane crisis level. If you think the COVID impact on the NHS has been bad, we face that every year in terms of inactivity. A majority of NHS work is around inactivity related ill health. So inactivity is the silent killer in the UK, and we don't talk about it and we don't mention it. It's even, you know, pollution kills orders of levels of magnitude less than inactivity does. And so we should be talking about it all the time, and about social prescriptions, and about, you know, obesogenic environments and inactivity environments, and you know, and one of the key predictors of inactivity is car ownership and car use. So yeah, but pollution is very important, but yeah, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword for us at the moment. It may not be for you, and it's very obviously very important to talk about.
Thank you, Simon. I realise we mustn't go on too long, but I did promise one person I would ask this question about when designing low traffic neighbourhoods, how do you manage for emergency vehicles being able to get through? Do you work with them, or do they come along and work out an alternative? We've got a few rising bollards in Oxford. Almost all of them, I think, haven't worked for years, and they're a bit of a joke. What's your answer to this?
Okay, so there's what I would like and what I know to be true, and there's what's happening right now, and these things are slightly separate. So in London, so emergency, so Professor Rachel Aldred, University of Westminster Active Travel Academy, has just published a study about Waltham Forest and the LTNs there, that showed, and I think this really sums up everything, that emergency response times didn't go up when all the LTNs went in, but the drivers and the service staff involved in emergency response blamed the LTNs for delays. So they perceived a problem that wasn't actually a problem, and it's understandable. You know, it's totally an understandable thing. The big delays to emergency services, we know, and the emergency services know: congestion, poor parking, cars, too many cars. Basically. So LTNs aren't the problem, and even LTNs where there is no gaps and it's just bollards and planters and whatever, aren't a problem long term. There is a short-term problem with sat navs and updating sat navs that is widely recognised. That's a problem for the emergency services to fix and sort, and it should have been sorted long ago. And it's frankly a scandal that it hasn't been sorted. The classic of this was there was a guy in the Olympic Park in London who had a heart attack 3 years after the Olympic Games, and it took 3 hours for the emergency service to reach him because the whole of the Olympic Park was not in their sat navs. So it's an ongoing issue with any road changes, including LTNs, that need sorting by the ambulance service, the government. It's the contract for their sat navs is a big problem. In terms of LTNs, what we have is right now, because of that kind of whole worry about response times and perception that this new thing is a problem, nearly all the LTNs that are going in London are going in with a gap and a camera. And that leads to some headlines. I think the Lambeth LTNs, the first two LTNs, have already netted them £1 million in fines, and they turned the cameras on in like September or October. So invariably the Mail and the Telegraph turn out and say, you know, terrible fines from drivers, you know, it's evil, etc. To which I can only respond, you know, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. You know, don't drive through a massively well signed, you know, thing that says don't go through here. And, you know, secondly, we have a whole bunch of cash strapped councils who are struggling in COVID, and Lambeth has just got £1 million to pay for the schemes, but also to pay for other road measures, including pothole repairs and stuff like that. So, you know, I think that's a fairly positive thing overall. So for now, we're certainly in London saying, if you want to, you know, if the emergency services who are statutory consultees turn around and say, we want a gap and a camera, then a gap and a camera they get. Long term, I think there'll be a discussion and an argument and a conversation about whether they actually need that, and whether they use it. What we saw in Hackney, in the kind of, because Hackney have been doing modal filters just very slowly from the 70s all the way through, and they never stopped. So with Hackney, they've got fire gates from the 80s and 90s that were put in, and they've gradually replaced them with planters and things like that, because no one ever opened them and no one ever kind of drove through them or needed to use them. So once the sat navs are updated, the emergency services don't drive through filters, they just go round, and it's quicker and easier. So I think the long term is they'll be replaced gradually by bollards and planters, but for now, cameras works fine.
Thank you. Alison, do you want to
Well, there was just one other question from Wendy Williams about e-scooters, and it'd be just quite interesting to hear your take on e-scooters.
Yeah, we like them, is the short answer. So again, I can't claim credit for this work, but I actually do really agree with it. Our policy forum did a long piece of research. Again, you can download it off our website. It's called something like micromobility, or it's a micromobility report, but micromobility is the main word. So we looked at the changing nature of mobility in London: e-scooters, electric bikes, bike share, cargo bikes, you know, etc. The full gamut of things that are, you know, move around and you know, electrically largely, and how they move around, but things that aren't cars basically, but that are bigger than walking and faster than walking. And I think the overall perception was that there isn't, I mean, there are all sorts of issues with e-scooters. E-scooters on pavements is a big issue, but the best solution for e-scooters, particularly given, and I don't know whether it's the same, but in London they're here, they're already widely used, is to put them in the cycle tracks, because that's the best place for them. You don't want to put them in traffic because they've got very small wheels, and they are not widely perceived by drivers in the same way as even bikes are. You don't want to put them on pavement because that obviously is a risk to pedestrians, because they move quite fast and they have got much higher bulk than pedestrians. So their natural fit is in cycle tracks or cycle lanes or low traffic neighborhoods, you know, on the road or whatever. So the same places that bikes go. They also have some level of activity to them. They are more active than just driving. They're less active than e-bikes, but you know, whatever. And similarly, they have similar safety issues. They're not a massive cause that we can see of road danger, but they are likely to suffer similar collisions and similar risks to people cycling. So the ultimate conclusion was that broadly they are yet another way of increasing active travel participation and moving us away from the car, and that they share a lot of common ground with cycling.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Simon. That was a really wonderful session, and you must be exhausted and you need your beer.